Thank you so much for that, Louise. That was a really sweet introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation and for saying such nice things. It's really kind of you. I want to begin by saying kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa, e ngā mana whenua o tēnei rohe, tēnā koutou. I would like to first of all acknowledge you all, and I also would like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose lands you are all zooming in from here today. I also need to begin by acknowledging my co-authors on this project because, as we all know, doing research is very rarely ever done by a single person. And so even though I'm the one giving this presentation today, I'd like to give a shout out for sure to Leo Salas, Nadav Noor, David Ainley, Sharon Stammerjohn, Jean Pennycook, Melissa Dozier, John Saints, Costa Stamatu, Luke Barrington, and Jay Rotella. And quite literally, it was a dream team, and I'm really honored to be here to be able to talk with you all today about crowdsourcing and how the combination of crowdsourcing, high resolution imagery, and wildlife ecology came up with the first ever population estimate for this awesome creature on the screen here, the Weddell seal. Oops. So just as a real brief kind of overview about what we know about the Weddell seal and why we did this project in the first place. So the Weddell seal is a very large, true pinniped, true seal that lives around the continent of Antarctica on the fast ice. So it's the ice that's connected to the Antarctic continent. And almost everything we know, particularly about the long-term demographics of the Weddell seal, is from McMurdo Sound. So in the basically the farthest stretches of the Southern Ocean is where this long-term population data set exists. It's been through a mark recapture data set. But of course, the Antarctic continent is huge, and the fast ice around the Antarctic continent is huge too. So there's lots of places where these animals could be, but there's very few places, well, just really only there's one place where we have long-term information about their populations. And as it turns out, these Weddell seals also, they tend to be prey generalists, but they also will prey upon Antarctic toothfish, which is the animal, of course, that you're seeing on the screen here. And we eat Antarctic toothfish as Chilean sea bass. And so the question is, if we have really a lot of information about this species, but really only in a certain spot, but there's lots of places where Weddell seals could exist, how do we gain information about how to best conserve or manage Antarctic toothfish and the Southern Ocean in general, particularly under climate change scenarios, because these animals are fast ice obligates, so very likely climate change may be impacting their habitats as well. So there's a bit of a conflict here. We know a lot about these animals from this one spot, but on the other hand, there's lots of places where they could be in existence, and we don't really know anything about how they're doing outside of McMurdo Sound. So then literally one day, I was working alongside the United States Antarctic Program at the University of Minnesota, and I came upon an image just like this. I was looking and actually making a map using this high resolution satellite imagery. It's just exactly like you'd see on Google Earth, where you can kind of zoom in and you can see your house and you can see cars driving around and stuff. It's really high resolution imagery on the order of about 40 to 60 centimeter resolution. So that's the size of a pixel. And I saw an image just like this, and these little kind of black dots hanging out on the ice here. And I had a pretty strong suspicion that those were all Weddell seals. And the nice thing about having done several years of work in Antarctica by that time was I knew a lot of people because I was making maps for them, and I knew exactly who to reach out to, and that was David Ainley. And he put me in touch with Don Siniff and Jay Rotella and Bob Garrett and lots of other folks, and away we went to figure out whether or not we could actually see these seals from space. We did what I would say probably a quick kind of proof of concept study to determine whether or not we could in fact see them and reliably figure out how the populations were doing from space. But then knowing that we had the capacity to do that, the question became, how do we operationalize this outside of just McMurdo Sound. There's, like I said, lots of space around the Antarctic continent where these animals could be. How on earth do we go about doing this? And at the time, there was a couple of fits and starts, I would say. I tried a couple of automated algorithms with my colleague Claire Porter. And as it turns out, even trying to do some sort of automated algorithm, it was actually faster for me to just count the animals where I knew they were than it was to try to train a program to do that. Now, that was quite some time ago, but at the time, it was really just faster for a single person to just go through and count the animals. But even if it was a single person, or say, even if you had a group of people looking at these images, it would take a really long time to do that. And so I just so happened to be telling that story to a colleague of mine at the Digital Globe Foundation, and he put me in touch then with Luke Barrington. And Luke Barrington was the one of the founders of TomNod, which was the online platform that basically gave anyone in the world access to this kind of high resolution imagery. You could go in and look at it. And at the time, that imagery had really been used, and TomNod had been used for kind of humanitarian purposes to look at landscape change. It hadn't been really used for a scientific question like this, but we thought we would give it a go. And so we decided to put together this project to see whether or not citizen scientists can help count seals around the entirety of Antarctica. And as I mentioned, no one had done this before. Hadn't done this before. We didn't really know what to expect, but we thought we'd give it a go. And so we put together not only, of course, our scientific questions, but also an educational packet so that this could be used in schools and with community groups. And in my view, part of the beauty of this is that it provided remote access, literally, to anyone who had access to an internet connection. And so, as somebody who's had the great fortune of being in Antarctica several times, knowing that we could at least provide, and I could show people kind of like, here's what I'm seeing when I'm looking at the imagery, what is it that you see? And to be able to share that experience was really special. And so we worked with groups like WWF and the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. We put all of the instructions and the tutorials up on SciStarter, and we gave it a go. The first thing that we decided to do was what's called a search area reduction. And we kind of joke that this is basically seal or no seal. Do you see seals or do you not? And the whole hope here was to host, I think it was 737 images of the fast ice around Antarctica in November of 2011, which is when we had the most imagery. Also, the reason we use November is because that's when the breeding females, or the females who are raising their pups, are hauled out on the ice, and they're not really doing a whole lot. They tend to be fairly stable in their movements in and out of the water. So we hosted these images and then effectively chopped them up into little pieces, which is what you're looking at here. So this pink box here is these little tiles, or these little maps. And what we then asked the crowd to do was to log on to tomnod.com and tell us whether or not you see seals in this image. And again, what that allowed us to do then was to kind of funnel down, rather than trying to count seals on hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of imagery, we were able to narrow down to the places where the seals were actually located. And so what we would ask people to look for is, of course, this is a crack in the ice right here. This whole image is a high resolution satellite image. And all these little black dots that you see here are Weddell seals hanging out on the ice. And so if you got this kind of an image shown to you when you were on tomnod.com, you would click this button that said seals, and then you would be given to go to another location, kind of a random location on the ice, and you would continue to vote that way. And I can say, as a participant, I found this really fun. I don't know if lots of other people did, but we did have this online forum where people could come in and ask us questions, and we had a lot of really great kind of back and forth about what people were seeing, and we were able to answer questions and things. It was a lot of fun for me. And so with that as our way of figuring out where all the seals were, so presence, absence, basically, one of the first things that we did to kind of figure out what we could do with this data is we decided to start in the Ross Sea, largely because all of us co-authors had quite a bit of experience in the Ross Sea, and so we thought, well, if we're going to start anywhere, we should start there because we kind of know what to expect. And so with the presence and true absence data within the Ross Sea from people voting on whether or not they saw seals on the imagery, we decided to put together a habitat suitability model. So in other words, what describes why seals are in certain places in the Ross Sea versus others. And so what you're looking at here, of course, is a map of the Ross Sea. And you'll notice I have these three boxes, A, B, and C. And the reason we have those is because we realized fairly quickly that there wasn't kind of a one-size-fits-all reason why seals were in certain places. And what we had to do was basically come together and make some sub-regions to help describe and really get to what is suitable habitat for seals in the Ross Sea. So we have the Eastern Ross Sea in A. South of the Dragulski ice tongue, we have the southern part of the Western Ross Sea, and then the northern part of the Western Ross Sea. And what we found based on this presence absence data is a couple of really interesting things. And the one that I tend to focus on is the relationship between seal presence and both penguin species. So in B here, what you have is the fact that Weddell seal presence is more probable the farther away they are from Adelie penguins. But it is more probable when the nearby emperor penguin colony is fairly small, which was kind of a finding that we weren't really sure of what to expect. So this was the part of the global model. So looking at the Ross Sea as a whole, this is some of the things that we found. And then when we really zoomed in to these three different regions, a couple of other things came out that I just want to mention real quickly. And the first is this distance to deep water. And as it turns out, in the southern part of the Ross Sea, so where McMurdo Sound is, there seems to be potentially this optimal distance to deep water. Now, the deep water, the reason we use deep water here as a variable was really as a proxy for prey volume, so the ability to find lots of different prey. But then when we looked at emperor penguins again, there seemed to be this relationship between the proximity to penguins. So in other words, what we learned here is that Weddell seals prefer to be away from Adelie penguins, but nearby emperor penguins, so long as the nearby colony isn't too big. So that's what we learned in the Ross Sea. So then when we decided to expand out and continue gathering data for the entirety of the fast ice around Antarctica, we learned a few other really key pieces of information. The first is that we were able to search effectively the size of New Zealand's worth of fast ice around Antarctica with more than 320,000 citizen scientists. And what we found is that seals were only present on about 0.55 of the available fast ice. And so they were very patchily distributed. And what you're looking at here is the red grids are basically all the places where we were able to search, with the exception of this part of the Western Antarctic Peninsula. And all of the places are where people thought they saw seals. Now, the reason I mention this is because we had to go through and actually correct for over-identification. We found that people were really, I guess what we call trap happy. They were really excited to see seals and oftentimes saw seals when there weren't actually seals there. So we had to do some correcting there as well. But it turns out that after we did those corrections, seals were only present on very little of the fast ice available. So then once we had all of these places where we knew seals were located, it was time to then go back to those places and actually ask people to count. And I have to say, I'm really glad we decided to go that route because, as I mentioned, people really like to see seals and they're over-identifying them. So I feel like if we had gone the route of trying to count them right away, we would have had seals everywhere, which is definitely not the case. And so what we did then is we said, okay, now that we know where they are, we're going to host the same exact images that you just voted on whether or not they were there, and ask people to then go through and click on all of the seals that you see. And so that's what you're looking at here is all of this crosshair represents your cursor, and all of these little black things on the ice here are all seals. And so then we would go through and ask people to click on all of the seals that they saw. Now, without going into the kind of the massive details about how this works, the one thing I wanted to mention is that there is an algorithm that exists to kind of narrow down and translate a crowd-based estimate. So all of these tags that people have been making about where seals are located and turning that into a population estimate. Because as I just mentioned, people like to see seals, so they were over-identifying for sure, but we do have a way of kind of narrowing that down into a reasonable population estimate. And so the way we did that is through this algorithm called CrowdRank, which real briefly, the way that works is it's consensus-based. So in other words, if 20 of us are all looking at the exact same image and we all say that there's probably 9 seals on this image, the likelihood that there are actually 9 seals on that image is pretty great. Whereas if a couple of people think there are 200 and a couple of people think there are only like 2, those things are less likely to occur. So it's a consensus-based algorithm, and it's based on kind of this wisdom of the crowd. The more people that agree on a feature being a seal, the more likely it is actually to be a seal. And so using some clever statistical algorithms and models that Leo and Nadav developed, we were able to then, like I said, narrow down an actual population estimate. And the first thing that we learned is that there weren't nearly as many Weddell seals that we thought. And having gone back through some of the older literature, it seemed as though the previous estimates were upwards of about 800,000 animals around Antarctica. And what we found is that there's very likely only about 202,000 breeding female Weddell seals. And the reason we say breeding female Weddell seals is because of the ground validation that we were able to do in Erebus Bay, again, working with Jay Rotella and that long-term demographic data set that they have been working on for quite some time. So we have the first ever population estimate, and we also learned that the Ross Sea, like far and away, has the most seals in Antarctica. And the place with the fewest seals was the Amundsen Sea. And this is a map of basically what that looks like. So again, what we see here is the Ross Sea has the vast majority, well, it has 42% of all of the seals in Antarctica, very few in the Amundsen Sea. And kind of surprisingly, I thought we would have seen more in the Weddell Sea here as well, but we just didn't. And because we not only had the continent-wide presence and also a population estimate, we then retested some of our hypotheses that we started with in the Ross Sea. And so we put together the same habitat variables in the Ross Sea, applied it to the entire continent to not only understand how many seals there are, but why seals are in certain places around the entire continent and not in others. And so we know they're very patchily distributed, but we also found that this relationship with the penguins seems to hold across the rest of the continent. And in the case of Adelie penguins, in this case, it seems as though there seems to be kind of this peak probability of presence nearby Adelie penguins, and then kind of trails off as you get farther away from Adelie penguins. And that relationship between the probability of seal presence and the size and the distance to emperor penguins seems to hold. So again, across the continent, Weddell seals like to be nearby emperor penguin colonies as long as the colony isn't too big. And so seems as though the seals, even outside of the Ross Sea, still perhaps not really a penguin fan, which is again, kind of interesting. And so now the point here is this is the time where we have the ability to monitor over time if we want. We have the data sets to build these new algorithms as well, and hopefully we can begin to inform policy at places like Camellar. And the final thing I just wanted to mention is this not only provided us with some firsts in understanding the global distribution and habitat for an ice obligate predator that lives in some of the most difficult places to get to in the world, but it also was really engaging, and it encouraged people to explore and ask us questions, and it provided access to this place where most people won't go. And that was really exciting, particularly when I see pictures like this of a young lady who heard about our project on the radio and rushed home to help us do our research. And so I like to end my presentations with this particular story because I think it's really powerful to remind ourselves why we do this kind of work. It's not just for adding knowledge to the universe, but it's also to make sure that we can conserve these animals and their ecosystems into the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. That was an incredible plenary talk. I wonder, do we have time for questions, Fang?
Yes, I think we have, a few minutes.
So,
2 quick questions.
Yeah, I wanted to just ask you, Michelle, whether you could comment a little bit about what are your future plans for other species that you might be working on?
Yeah, so we've tried to adapt this for crab eater seals, which has been a little bit more difficult. We've done the same type of thing in the Weddell Sea, and that has been a little bit more difficult and a little bit more challenging. So I think we're going to have to get a little bit more creative. So definitely we're going to try it with other seals, and I know some colleagues are working on other animals like whales and things, but we've done this with the Adelie penguins and emperor penguins. So hopefully we can start to put the pieces of the puzzle together and figure out a little bit more about the ecosystem as a whole, rather than just looking at single species.
Jamie, you have a question?
Yeah, I think it's amazing talk. Thanks, Michelle. 320,000 participants, that's a huge number of people to get involved in a project like this. And I just wondered what you thought the recipes was for success with a citizen science project like this.
So I think the reason that we were able to get that many people involved was largely because Tom Nod and Digital Globe had a list of about 1 million email addresses that they were able to push out through their email newsletters and chains and things like that. So I think that was a really big deal right there. But the other thing we did was we did a couple of press releases. So that very last picture of that young lady, she heard about us on the radio. So we did a little bit of that. And then I did what I could on Twitter.
Well, it's a great success and well done on the paper that came out recently.
Thank you so much.